Hello everybody, my name is Cecilia Palmer. I am a mental health counselor with the Hamilton Family Health Team, and I'm here to talk to you today about understanding grief during COVID-19 and how we adjust to loss during this pandemic. So in this session, it is an open forum. You can ask questions. Nobody else will be able to see your questions, and I will not be reading any identifying information about you, so there's no question that is too silly to ask here. All questions are welcome. And we will dive right in here. So our objective today is going to be developing a greater understanding of grief in general and how our grief could be impacted because of the pandemic, and the things that we can do to help promote our own healing and take care of ourselves. So grief is any response to any type of loss. It's the emotions we feel and express, whether we're expressing those emotions publicly or privately. Bereavement, however, is the state of being. Bereavement actually has the Latin roots of the word mean to be robbed. So when you are bereaved, you are robbed of something or someone who is meaningful to you. And often when you are robbed, it's unexpected, it's not at a time that you wanted, and it's a loss that you had never hoped for. So it's being deprived of someone or something valuable. Mourning, however, is that public face of grief. Those are, the flowers that we put up at the site of someone's death. It is now we're adjusting to a social media world, so it is the expressions of condolences, and sometimes those videos we share about people who are meaningful to us, whether we knew them directly or not. So I'm thinking most recently about someone like Kobe Bryant. There was a great public mourning about his death, for example. Anticipatory grief are all those losses that you experience leading up to the death of somebody you care about. This is often seen in people where they have a loved one experiencing dementia. You tend to lose the person before you lose their body, and there are all these losses that go along with that you grieve. And at the same time, you are anticipating or expecting that you are going to lose them again in the future. And when you think about that loss, feelings and emotions of grief come up for you. We're going to talk about secondary losses too. Often when people are experiencing grief, they feel like, well, I'm grieving over a person, and that is correct. You are grieving over a person, but you're also grieving over everything that person meant for you, everything that they did. So in the case of a partner, you could be grieving the person who you would argue over what to have for dinner, or the person who would take out the trash. And all those roles that person filled in your life, you are also losing in addition to them, and that's hard. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So as you can see, in the center of the slide, I'm looking off to the side because that's where my big screen is. So in the center, you'll see the pandemic, and that would be our primary loss. So I'm going to use this as an example. The pandemic is our primary loss. And as a result of that one loss, we have all these other subsequent losses. So loss of routine and predictability. We still, are not sure about what's going to be happening as we move forward. We're entering our second phase here in the Hamilton area, but what that means and the sustainability of that is up in the air. So we can't actually predict what things are going to look like 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now. For a lot of us, we are experiencing a loss of employment, loss of income, loss of stability. Our financial health is impacted by that. For some of us, we're having loss of independence and freedom, definitely a loss of entertainment and social life. People are cheering and grateful to, be able to go out and get a haircut and extend their social circle at this point. Loss of celebrations. We are getting ready to finish the school year, and a lot of our kiddos have worked really, really hard to be at a completion, whether that's graduating grade 8 or high school or college or university. And their ceremonies, their rituals that they use to celebrate are not happening in the same way. And so that is a big loss as well. We're going to talk a little bit about loss of endings too, because when we have a loved one who is quite ill or dying or has died during COVID, we are losing those rituals, opportunities, and experiences that we had to be connected to them and close to them, as we are not allowed to engage in seeing them in the same ways that we would without a pandemic. So it's really impacting our grief. I'm just going to go back to the slide for a second. What I want to sort of paint the picture about is that, and for people to really understand, is that grief is not about being in the same boat. We use this expression a lot about, oh, you know, I've had my mom die too, or I know what it's like, or in relation to this pandemic, people can say, oh, we're all in the same boat here. We're all going through the same thing. And while that's true, we are all going through the same thing together. It's not the same boat we're in, it's the same storm we're in. And so we're all in this same storm together, but what your boat might look like and what my boat might look like may be different. So if you're in a yacht, you could ride out the storm of the pandemic, you could ride out the storm of grief, for example, much differently than if I'm in a rowboat. Those waves and that storm is going to feel significantly different for me than it would for you. And, you know, being in a rowboat will have a different experience than somebody who's in a shipwreck. So while we want to have empathy and feel like we're all in this together, we are. But how we respond to this is going to be based on the boat that we're in. So be considerate in that of yourself, and be considerate of that in yourself, because a lot of times when we're grieving, we're doing a lot of comparing to other people. Well, you know, I know so-and-so had their mom die and they're not as upset, or they didn't seem as upset as I am. Something must be wrong with me. You have to consider that your boat is different than theirs. So that's an important piece to remember. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the most recognizable and most misunderstood grief model that exists, and it is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her 5 stages of grief. Most of us have come across this in some way in our lives, so I'm going to use this as a way to think about it, but I'm going to change maybe how you think about the 5 stages of grief. So we're going to go through this model with this idea that you go in to start a car. So imagine it's a cold winter day, not at all like today, and you go to your car and you put the key in the ignition and you turn it, and it like won't start. It gives you that good sound. The first thing we do is we deny it. We have an overwhelming sense of denial that a car isn't starting. So it doesn't start on the first turn, and what do? We try again. Come on. And we'll turn that key a few times. Maybe we'll pump the gas. You know, we might do some things to hopefully make it work. But all of these attempts are these little ways that we deny that the car won't start. We're denying that there's a problem at all with the car. And then once you can't deny that anymore, you move into anger. You might get frustrated. You might start hitting the steering wheel. You might use some super colorful language to sort of, you know, express the fact that you're angry that your car won't start, because that's not how cars are supposed to work. Your assumption is that you're getting into your car and that it will start and you'll be able to drive away. Once you're done sort of hitting the steering wheel and being all upset, you might start bargaining. You might start talking to the car, to the universe, to the powers that might be, saying, okay, please, if you just start this one time, I promise, I know I'm delayed on that oil chart. I know that I know I'm supposed to get a new battery, and I promise I'll get a new battery if you'll just run for me this one time. And so we start to make these agreements with the universe, hoping that it will be able to solve our problem. When that fails, you'll find yourself in a place of depression. And that can sound like a heavy sigh. And then this overwhelming sadness of everything that is now this car not starting is costing you. That's it. I might as well quit my job. I'm going to lose my house because I'm going to be late for work. And what's the point? So I'm going to be late. I might as well not come in. My boss is going to get angry. I'm just going to end up getting fired and lose my home. I'm going to move in with my parents. You know, so we'll sort of do this thing where we kind of go to that worst case scenario. Excuse me. And then once we've sort of worked through that aspect of it, we find ourselves at acceptance. And what that actually sounds like and looks like is not happiness that the car won't start. We're not grateful or okay with the fact that the car won't start. What we do is we say, well, I'm acknowledging the car won't start, so I should go in and probably call myself a cab or ask my partner if I can drive their car into work or if they could drop me off. Acceptance means that you understand the impact of your car not starting on you, and you plan on how to move forward with the fact that you don't have a car, that your car won't start. So that's sort of what we think about in terms of grief. It's important to know that these aren't stages. I know I discussed it in a way, first you had denial, then anger, then bargaining, depression, acceptance. That's not what it is. It's a lot messier than that. So if you picture a big messy ball of yarn or a plate of spaghetti, where all the pieces are sort of intertwined with one another, and they don't really follow some linear proper fashion, that is what it's more like. So you might start with anger or bargaining. You may find yourself at a place of acceptance quite early on in your grief experience, and then you'll find yourself back to denial. So it's not one and done. Once you're done the stage, you're okay and you move on, you don't feel those things again. It's more of this messy experience of different kinds of emotions that you could feel. I want to bring up this model of 4 C's of grief. I'm just going to take a sip if anybody has any questions. So what are the 4 C's of grief? The 4 C's of grief are a model that is rooted for kids primarily, that I kind of see and adapt it for all people, regardless of age, going through any unexpected grief, loss, or experience. This could be loss of a job. This could be separation, divorce. This can be a death. And so we all have these questions when bad things happen that we have to help us make sense and reorganize our world. Because when we experience a grief, what happens is we absolutely lose touch with what we call the assumptive world. And you have this, I have this, we have this world that makes sense in our mind. We predict, this is how we can plan for the future. We predict what tomorrow is going to be like, and the next day and the next day. We predict that we'll get to work safely or to the grocery store safely. And we predict that we'll go to bed at night and wake up the next morning. So we have this assumptive world that operates, that allows us to move in it. And when a grief happens, we often lose that assumptive world. We lose that predictable world that we knew. A lot of people who are grieving will tell me that even though the world looks the same to them, it feels completely different. So they're navigating a world in which the tree looks like the tree and people look like people, but how they view it and feel it is completely different. And so we have this need to reorganize and make sense of that world again, and the 4 C's helps us do that. So the first question that we ask is, can I catch it, right? So, we're thinking about if we have a parent who's diagnosed with a cancer, for example, and there's some genetic component of that cancer, we may start to ask ourselves, is this something that I could get to? If my mom had this or my dad had this, is this something that I could get? And in some cases with contagion, like COVID, if you have a loved one who ends up being diagnosed with COVID, you may start to worry about your own element of contagion. The next piece is, did I cause it? Is there something that I did that can make this happen? And this is very much a guilt thing. So a lot of the first one is about your own health, and the second two are about your need to make sense of the world and control the world again. So did I cause this? I've worked with lots of young kids, for example, who have said, I heard that stress causes cancer. My parents would always talk about how I stressed them out. I must have caused their cancer. And I think we do this too when we're adults. So if you were to send a loved one to the store in a snowstorm at 10 o'clock at night and they got into a car crash and something bad happened, we would do that to ourselves. We would say, this is my fault. I knew I shouldn't have sent them out. I forgot to pick it up on the way home. This is like, they wouldn't be in this predicament if I hadn't have messed up. So that part is really important in that reorganization of the assumptive world, because I'd rather me be to blame and be responsible than, because I can control that. I can make sense of that. So that's why that's important. Could I have cured it? Is there something I could have done to make this person's illness not pleasant? And I've heard this a lot with people who have had family members die from heart disease or congestive heart failure or other elements where diet and lifestyle may have been a factor in catching that illness or getting that illness. I knew I shouldn't have made him bacon. He loved bacon, and I knew I shouldn't have done that. Or I knew I should have pushed him to retire earlier. He was always so stressed out at work, right? Is there something that I could have done so that I'm not living in this place right now? And then the last one is who will care for me? Because when we lose people that are very meaningful, that are a part of our circle of love, they leave a huge, huge opening. And we don't have that same connection, we don't have that same care, and we wonder who will be left to care for us and take care of us if we've always had them in our lives. So here's the myths of grief that we're going to talk about. A myth is, keeping busy, avoiding reminders, not talking about grief, that all these things would make it easier for the griever to move on. Not necessarily true. I want to also talk about this idea of talkers cope better. Clearly, I'm a bit of a talker, but there's no evidence to suggest that if you talk about your feelings, you'll get through your feelings faster or better than somebody who is a little bit more quiet or reserved in there and is more of a thinker or a doer. There's this concept of instrumental versus intuitive grievers. And a lot of you, when I say that, those words don't mean anything, but I'll kind of explain them and you'll be like, oh, I bet you know somebody who is either an instrumental or intuitive griever, and you'll be able to recognize yourself in this too. So an intuitive griever is what we sort of imagine as that person who's more comfortable with expressing their sad emotions outward. They want to talk and retell their story about their loved one. They're a lot more comfortable with the thinking and processing, looking at the pictures, reminiscing, wanting to hold on to those tokens of that person. And the instrumental griever is a bit different than that. They're the person who is the doer. They want to make sure that the arrangements are done on time. Do we have enough food for everybody? Have we considered? They're the planners and doers. And you might not see them cry and look like they're really emotionally responding. They actually could look like they're functioning super well, but they're just grieving in their own really unique way. And I think depending on the loss, we can find ourselves, it's not a fixed state either. You're not either instrumental or intuitive. I think depending on the loss, we may respond differently. So there might be times where you are instrumental in your grief, and there might be times where you're a bit more intuitive, and that's okay too. The reason why it's important to consider this is because in any given family, not everyone will be the same. And one thing that we can do to combat isolation in our grief is to recognize how others are grieving, even if they are quite different than we are, and provide love and support and empathy and understanding towards that. And maybe even share this idea with them that it's okay, we can all do it different ways, and it doesn't mean that one feels more or one feels less. It's just a unique way of expressing it. It's important to know that there's a myth that time heals all wounds, and that we're back to normal in work would have you say 3 days, 3 months, 6 months, a year. There's this magical number of a year. It happens, apparently babies sleep through the night at 1 year old, although I haven't seen that evidence personally. This idea that grief resolves itself in about a year time and then you're fine and you moved on. So I've seen a lot of people in counseling who come at that year past mark, and they're feeling like their grief is quite present still, and they feel like there's something defective or wrong with them because they're still grieving. And a lot of what we're figuring out is that first year of work, we have to do a lot of instrumental tasks. We have to re-navigate ourselves to this world that doesn't make sense anymore. And that often the emotional aspects of grieving can happen going into that second year, which is surprising for a lot of people. The other thing is that grief gets different. So what happens is, we used to think that grief heals over time, time heals all wounds. What we know is that your grief, when it experiences, if it's the circle here, this stays the same for the rest of our lives. So no matter what happens, your grief will remain exactly the same. But what happens is, if I can keep that circle, your life will expand and grow around that grief. And at certain times in the future, anniversaries of their death, on birthdays, holidays, special occasions, your life then shrinks, and then all you can sort of be in that moment is that grief. And then when that time has passed, you can remember these parts of your life, and your life expands around it again. And inside your grief, it's not necessarily always so dark and gray and hard. It becomes a little bit softer. It becomes a bit lighter, and it's not quite as sharp as it was before. Okay, the edges get smoothed over. Another myth is that it gets easier to deal with when it happens again. It's not true. We don't get immune to grief the more times we're exposed to it. Often grief can be, when we have a new grief, it kind of opens up those own experiences. Again, your world shrinks back to that original grief. There's a myth that grief after that anticipated or expected death is easier. I wish that anticipatory grief would make grieving after somebody dies easier, but it doesn't. It's its own unique type of grief, and so it doesn't make it better. But a lot of people will judge themselves and say things like, you know, mom was sick for so long, how come this, I shouldn't be surprised, I shouldn't be as hurt as I am now. I'm here to tell you that that's okay, that that's actually pretty normal. So don't beat yourself up if that's happening. Another thing to consider is that the mourner must be devastated. It's complicated. Relationships are tricky. You know, we are all wired as humans for a relationship, but for a species who depends on relationship, we often cannot be so great at navigating relationships. So you can't assume that somebody who loses their mother is going to be more grief-stricken than somebody who loses their aunt. The relationship depends not on the title of the relationship, but of the nature of the relationship. So I've seen lots of people who've had a pet bird die and it's been absolute devastation, but they've been able to like bury their uncle without really having a lot of grief. So don't judge, don't assume, and just accept what people tell you is their truth and their reality. And don't judge yourself either. So some signs of grief that we are familiar with. Trouble, these are all normal, right? I'm not going to talk too much about a complicated grief because it really only impacts, it's kind of interesting when people come into counseling, they feel often that they're in that part of complicated grief. They really, really judge their grief. But I think it's only somewhere around, 4 to 6% of the population actually experiences really clinical, complicated grief that we could diagnose as being problematic. Most of us, that's like 95% of us, have normal grief that we're just not prepared for as a society and a culture. So we feel like we're defective in it, although it's a normal response. So we're going to talk about that a bit. So normal grief looks like trouble focusing on normal tasks. You're forgetting everything. The milk is ending up in the cupboard instead of the fridge. These are things that are quite normal and appropriate. Your brain, again, is trying to create that new world, trying to adjust to a new world in which your loved one does not exist anymore. And that is a very, very difficult process for your brain to go through. Sleeping more or less than usual, again, very normal at the beginning of grief. Feelings of anger and irritability, incredibly normal. You're going to be a bit more short-tempered, and so I know even going through my own grief, I front-loaded, or I told people who were close to me who were most likely in the range of my short temper or my shorter frustration. Hey, you guys might notice that I might not be as patient as I usually am. You know why. People in your circle will know why. Can you please be a bit more patient, or can you extend me a bit more grace? I would really appreciate it. And then I also checked in that for myself. Physical symptoms are super common when you're grieving: headaches, upset stomach, heart racing, chest tightness. These are all very common symptoms in grief. Fatigue or low energy. Grieving is a lot of work and it's exhausting. So if you're finding you barely have the energy to brush your teeth, that is pretty normal at the beginning. Re-experiencing feelings of past grief. Why am I still thinking about my dog Chipper, who died when I was 5? This doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. It's part of grief. Sometimes engaging in activities such as eating, drinking, or online shopping to cope with feelings of grief or anxiety. Distraction is good in grief. Distraction is great when we're having any feelings that are difficult to feel. But there's a difference between distraction and avoidance. So if something becomes overwhelming, you can distract with something that is soothing. But then when you feel like you're able to address it again, you don't want to avoid it. You want to kind of come back to that feeling and see what's happening for you. And again, avoiding thinking or talking about the pandemic, avoiding thinking or talking about your grief, these are also normal. again, instrumental versus intuitive. Some people really want to surround themselves with memories and objects that keep them feeling closer to the person who's died. Some people, and like the pandemic, some people want to know a lot of information, want to, view every news conference that our premier and prime minister are having, and some of us don't want it. Again, this is not about what's right or what's wrong. It's about taking stock of yourself and doing what feels right for you. So what grief might feel like: being on edge and not being exactly clear why. So this looks like a sense of dread, almost like you're more startled. You startle a little bit more easy. You're waiting for that other shoe to drop. You might be hyper vigilant. You might be hyper vigilant for yourself, and you might be hyper vigilant for others. So you may, with those physical symptoms, upset stomach or chest tightness. Oh no, do I also have a cardiac problem? Oh no, do I, is this pain I'm feeling, is that cancer too? So we have some hypervigilance, and also we'll see that in people we love, especially if we're scared of losing. So if we've lost one parent, had one parent die, we might become hypervigilant with the other parent because we can't fathom a world in which we don't have our parents. Freezing up, procrastinating, those are also common. Being angry, easily frustrated, persistently frustrated. Small obstacles feel super intolerable. Somebody going the wrong way in a grocery store during this pandemic, somebody getting in your way in a grocery store prior to this pandemic, prior to grief, may have felt something that you could tolerate. Now it is almost having the feeling of wanting to bump into them with your cart, or giving them a glare or some notice that they're doing something wrong. So it's not uncommon to have those experiences. Resigning yourself to the worst case scenario, that's also common. So you mentally and emotionally prepare for that worst case scenario. For some people, this could be disengaging from relationships, not wanting to get hurt again, and so cutting yourself off, or thinking that if you cut yourself off emotionally, that you'll protect yourself from future hurts. Spoiler alert, that doesn't really work very well. The hurt still comes. We can try to fool ourselves into thinking that things won't hurt as much if we shield ourselves, but it doesn't actually keep us safe, and it doesn't actually keep us from being hurt. You find yourself withdrawing or avoiding others. That is not necessarily helpful either, although this is very common in grief. What happens is we stop taking those calls and we stop engaging with other people because we are a death-denying society. We don't really do well with other people who are really hurting, and so we've reached out maybe, and people have given us short answers or judgments about our grief. And then we also have this real fear in society of becoming a burden to others. I don't want to lay my problems on them. I'm going to make them depressed, or I'm going to make them sad if I talk about my mom again, or, my partner again. We're assuming that shielding them and avoiding them actually protects ourselves from their stress and anxiety. And we also assume that it protects them from our stress and anxiety. But frankly, we need people in our lives. Completely exhausted. Overwhelmingly, this is incredibly important to keep in mind. Your exhaustion is valid. You may attend to chores less. Your house might be in a state that it's never been in before. Little things doing the dishes or unloading the dishwasher can feel like a monumental task. Sleep disruption. And what happens is when we lose that assumptive world, when we lose somebody, and although the cascade of losses that come, the secondary losses, our body is in a perpetual state of stress, fight, flight, or freeze. Our bodies are pumped full of cortisol and adrenaline, and it keeps us amped up in case we need to react quickly to a threat. This is super common in anxiety. It's also super common in grief. One of the side effects of that is that we end up feeling super worn down and tired because we can't sustain being that activated on a daily basis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can do if we have a loved one right now who is vulnerable, elderly, at risk, has COVID, or is in the hospital, or hospice, palliative care right now, and we can't access them because of the current restrictions due to COVID. These are not, I want to be really clear, these are not just as good. I'm not even going to pretend that the things that I'm offering are as meaningful or as good as being able to touch and be close to a loved one. However, this is something we can do, even if it is a far second from being able to be in close proximity to the people we love at a very important time. So we can move phone calls to video calls. Staff members in medical institutions are, I think, trying to do the best they can in acclimating and adjusting this too, and are willing to have some sort of video connection where possible. You can do alternative kind of visits. You can visit at the window. You can send virtual hugs. You can send personalized letters. That hug is a kids activity that we use. If you have a little one at home who misses someone and can't be with them, you can, outstretch their arms. You can't see me outstretching because I'm so far away, but you pretty much outstretch your arms, trace around their fingers on a piece of cotton or a t-shirt that's been opened up or a pillowcase that's been opened up so it's nice and long. You trace their fingers and their arms and hands, and you write notes. You get the kid or yourself, you can write them little notes, and that can be like a virtual hug or, a memento hug that you can have, and your loved one can receive it and put it on them and feel like they're close to you. You can create something called an ethical will, and that's a concept from Judaism. The idea is pretty simple. Everyone can share something that they learned from that person. The legacy of that person, let them, that's going to be with them forever. So, I remember that this person was the first one to teach me how to, fold a fitted sheet without making it a mess. Or this is the first person who taught me how to properly tie a tie. Like, these things are legacy pieces. So everybody can share something about that person that will stay with them forever. And it can be the smallest things to the largest things. I remember, my dad always telling me that, when a couple is together, it's very hard work, and you always need, somebody needs to always be working towards that relationship, because you can't always be, both partner can't always be doing it 100% all the time. So that's always stuck with me. So that's like a legacy piece. Or something as simple as be a generous tipper. You can even record audio clips or video clips that can be spliced together. Get your young ones who are tech savvy to put it together and share it with them, or share it with with other people. You can read to the person as a family. Reading is a really soothing activity. It is something that most of us experienced in childhood. And so when you do that for an adult, there's just something calming and soothing when you're read to. Create their oral history, get their history down. You don't know, we never know everything about somebody, so see what you can figure out. And now's the time to get to know the people in your world who might not be around here forever. Pray, connect with a higher power. Everybody has their own unique understanding of the universe, and where faith and religion plays in that for them. And this is not like a statement that everybody should engage in that, but connect with what is meaningful to you and keeps you grounded to the universe, and reach out to others that feel the way you do for support. Play music, food, song mementos. You can keep that person in your mind, send them an audio recording of your favorite song, or a song maybe that they sang to you when you were younger. Sing it back to them and record it, and that would be very enjoyable. We know that, or we believe that hearing is one of those last sensations to go as somebody is reaching the end of their life. So even if somebody who is dying is unable to respond, they are most often hearing those really lovely things that you are saying and sharing with them. So do that. It's important. Sorry, I just really need a sip of water. It's important to consider these 5 statements. Please forgive me. I forgive you. Thank you. I love you. And goodbye. Think about your relationship with that person and what might still need to be said from you. And this can be a very powerful and a very painful thing to do, but a very worthwhile thing to do. To send these messages, and sometimes it's not one, sometimes it's all of them. But don't wait till it's too late. Let the people know, the person in your life know what they meant to you. If there is hurts that they've done you, you might not, you don't necessarily need an I'm sorry from them. You might never get that, but you can be in control of your own forgiveness of their hurts of you. So that's something to consider too, okay? Rituals after death, we can think about, this is where COVID is really interrupting our ability to grieve, and where this can lead to some complications is that we're kind of moving away as a society from rituals and funerals, so formalized events that memorialize somebody's life. We use commonly in this society ideas of, I don't want people to cry for me, I don't want people to have, I want people to have a party, I don't want it to be sad, I want you to celebrate. But the truth is that funerals and other formalized rituals, whether they're rooted in religion or not, are essential rites of passage. They are important in helping us organize someone's death in our mind, body, and soul. So we've had some sort of funeral ritual since the dawn of time. It helps us acknowledge the reality of a death. It helps us remember the person who's died, and helps share memories of them with others. And it helps us support each other. It's a collective showing up for one another to say, I'm here to witness your suffering and pain, and I'm here to show up for it. It helps us express our inner thoughts and feelings. It marks the significance of the life that was lived. When somebody who is incredibly important to you dies, they were significant, and to pretend that they weren't is a disservice to you in your grief, and disservice to them in some way. So, these rituals also help us embrace the wonder of life and death. And it's the starting point of something called continuing bonds, which is this idea that death ends a life, not a relationship. And it helps us adjust and transition into our relationship with a loved one in which they were here, and our relationship with a loved one in which they are no longer here. And I know that sounds a little bit silly for a lot of people, and it sounds a bit far out there. And I don't mean you necessarily like envision them and imagine them here. But what I'll often say to somebody when they feel like they're missing that wise person in their life is, I'll say, okay, if you got into a fender bender and called that person, if you called your grandma, or you called your mom, or you called your brother, could you predict what they would say? And unanimously I've heard, yeah, I absolutely know what they would say if I got into a fender bender. And so I give them the message that, so then you can reach out to them and you can ask them, what should I do here? I'm struggling, I need some thoughts. And then let their words come to you, because you worked hard in that relationship. You had this relationship with them for a good part of your life. And so call on that and that wisdom that you have of them to inform you moving forward. That's a way you can keep that relationship still alive. So that's a really good thing to do. So if you can, try to have an initial service like early and in a timely fashion. It doesn't have to be, it can't be currently with our restrictions. It can't be a large thing, but we can have some sort of small ceremony wherever we are. So if you can't get to fly back to where somebody is because of travel restrictions, you can do your own service on your own time. We don't have to have these very formalized funeral home type of experiences all the time. You can do something as simple but meaningful as making the bread that they taught you to make, that you would make with them every Sunday, and making that with their photo or a candle lit or a particular song, and with the intention of remembering them. That can be a ritual to remember somebody who is meaningful that has died. Leverage technology. I am meeting virtually with all of you, which is wonderful. Although not as great as in person, I still feel like I'm able to connect and share some ideas, and hopefully you guys will share some of your thoughts and ideas with me too. It helps to foster some level of closeness and participation. You can also plan a larger service or reception when the pandemic restrictions have lifted. and sort of prepare for that as a way of a ritual. Okay, how to cope. So what do we want to do to cope with COVID loss? The most important thing, well, there's a lot of important things. Practicing self-care is a very, very vital, essential thing. And I don't like to get into really complex explanations of what self-care looks like. What I will say is, if you follow this ground rule, you're going to be okay. And it's the idea of treating yourself like your pet or your plant. Some people are pet people, some people are plant people. So think about it. Both of those need every day some amount of sunshine, some amount of nourishment and food, some amount of water and hydration. They need to be tended to. They either need to be stroked, or they need to, have a piece of deadheading done, and they need to be spoken gently to. Studies have shown if you yell at a plant in a very mean way, it will not grow as well. So imagine what happens when we're yelling at ourselves. We don't grow as well either. So if you treat yourself and think about, quite simply, am I treating myself like a plant? Am I treating myself like a pet? And think about those elements and just do those things for yourself. When you feel like everything else is impossible, you will be okay. And if you are, most people, even in the depths of despair, will make sure that their pet gets enough to drink, goes outside to get some sunshine, does the bare minimum of care. So just even the bare minimum of care is really important. And it will help you get you to that point where you can do more. More advanced idea of self-care would be 5 components of self-care. So rather than those really indulgent things that we think are self-care, such as, well, I'm gonna just, order a bunch, I'm ordering a pizza sitting in front of Netflix, and I'm going to not leave my couch for 5 days. Well, that's indulgent self-care, and sometimes we have needs to do those indulgent things. It's not actually self-care that helps take care of ourselves. So here's what they are. We need to feel our feelings without judging them. This is very tricky to do. We've been taught to really judge and nullify the thoughts and feelings we have and invalidate them, and that leads to lots of mental health complications. So I almost feel like a lot of the sort of inorganic mental health concerns we have, depression, anxiety, would fare much better if we learned how to talk to ourselves with compassion and kindness. Making some space for playfulness, practicing kindness, or those indulgent practices as well as compassion, actively discouraging unsolicited advice. This is very important in grief. Everybody thinks they know what you should be doing. I'm thinking about somebody who was grieving the loss of a newborn infant, and they were getting conflicting messages from friends and family. Some people were saying, I thought you'd be done now. I think you're kind of being over dramatic. Maybe you should go get some pills from the doctor. Got that response all the way to, oh, so you're done grieving now. You're moved on. You're doing better. That must be nice. So really, really discourage unsolicited advice and honor and hold true to what you know to be right for you. Also respect your time and expect others to do the same. It is okay when you are grieving to have tighter boundaries around where you expend your energy. So say no. No is a complete sentence. You're entitled to that. You want to give yourself time. So in grief, there is no finish line. Grief is not something you will ever be over. It is something that you learn to live with. And so therefore, we're not going to worry about when I'm done, because you will never be done grieving somebody who is so significant in your life. You will just learn to live in a world where they don't exist. There is no reward for speed as such. There's no invisible finish line. Nobody's going to congratulate you for grieving faster than other people, so don't worry about that part of it. Other people's discomfort with your grief will be their discomfort with your grief. You need to be okay with yours. And this last concept is called divine momentum, and that is the belief that grief in itself is a healing act, that grief heals itself by grieving, and to trust where you are in that grief process, and to honor that where you are now is where you need to be. Okay. So how else can we cope? We can be proactive. So a lot of the time, the hypervigilance and the anxiety might be telling you that you need to take care and think about what happens to you. So You know, we just had an unfortunate accident in our province where, you know, a mom and her children died. And if that's creating anxiety for you, then that might be the message that says, do I know and do my loved ones know what needs to happen if I couldn't make choices for myself? Do my loved ones know, and have I planned for how I'm going to take care of the people, you know, my obligations, my family members? Have I figured that out? Have I talked with them? Am I worried about my parents? Do I know what my parents want? Would my parents want to have life-sustaining measures or not? So if you don't have those questions and you're staying up at night having anxiety about it, seek those answers. Have conversations. Speak Up Canada, which is at that website, advancedcareplanning.ca, has lots of information about advanced care planning. It has workbooks and guides that you can access for free. It talks about how to choose your substitute decision maker. It has conversation starters for your family. This is a really morbid thing for a lot of people. A lot of people are uncomfortable having this. There's a lot of myths and beliefs that if we talk about this stuff, we're going to conjure it in our lives. But it's really important we know sometimes the greatest gift we can give people is peace of mind at a very, very difficult place. And so, you know, you can bring it up to a parent, for example, say, this is hard to talk about and this is scary to talk about. But what would be scary for me is to be in a position to make a decision for you and to feel like I would totally mess it up and make the wrong one. So can you give me some, can we talk about this even though it's uncomfortable? So sometimes we can do that. And it has some frequently asked questions too. So proactivity is a great way to cope with our loss and grief as well. We were talking a little bit about how we talk to ourselves, how we can be invalidating, how we can, you know, be quite cruel, and the importance of self-compassion. So what's important to know is for others, and also very importantly for yourself, we need to validate our lived experience and trust that it deserves to show up in the way that it is. We want to know that there's no wrong or right way to feel when you are grieving, or anytime. Your feelings are valid and okay. And that our feelings are dependent on the boat that we're in, going back to the beginning of this session today. So trust that, you know, if you're experiencing the storm in the way that you're experiencing, it's okay that you are. And it's important to know that validation isn't agreeing. So, you know, somebody could be saying, well, I don't miss grandma at all. And it's not that you are saying they're right or they're wrong when you're validating. You're just saying, for you, you're feeling like you don't miss her. Okay. That has no bearing on how much you miss her. So think about that sort of validation as that validation doesn't mean I have to agree with what's being said. Validation means that I can bring myself to understand why somebody might say that or feel that. So you might not understand why you feel anger in grief. I don't know why I'm angry. I should be okay. A lot of times validation, people would feel a struggle with validation when they're feeling relieved when somebody dies. When most of us die from a chronic condition, and most of us don't die suddenly. So 90% of us will die from some chronic, long-standing condition, which often is a decline in function, decline in abilities, increase in pain and suffering to some degree. And so when you get to the end of a 10-year journey of a loved one with dementia, for example, you may find a sense of relief after somebody dies. And there can be a lot of shame associated with that. But I want you to know it is absolutely okay that you feel a sense of relief if somebody you love was suffering quite a bit, either emotionally suffering or physically suffering, and that you feel at peace that they're no longer having that suffering. Okay, so validate your own lived experience. Ways we can do that is I have that list of what invalidation is. And we've heard these things. We've been on the receiving end of these things. I hate to admit it. You too, probably. We've all been on the giving end of this from time to time. Typically, when we're on the giving end of this, it's because we're going to be uncomfortable with their suffering and we're trying to make it better. That's the hard part about this, is that invalidation often comes from wanting to remove or make somebody feel better about their suffering, but we really can't do that. We can just join people in that, and you can join yourself in that. You can't take away your suffering. So look at the bright side. Could be worse. You're overreacting. You're too sensitive. Being emotional won't help. It will just get better. Just don't worry about that. Time heals. So what validation sounds like, and You can, if you're not sure what to say in validation, you can almost input any one of these at any time, genuinely feeling them, and they'll work. Your struggle is hard. This is painful. This sucks. That makes sense. It makes sense that you're angry because, you know, you always showed up for them and they didn't call you. Whatever that sounds like. Your feelings matter. Your emotions are important. And yeah, that hurts right now. That must really hurt right now, right? To, you know, they didn't call you until the next morning. That must hurt. So, you know, you can certainly see how those are different. And I want you to pay attention, if you can, when you're talking to yourself. Do you talk to yourself from a place of invalidation or validation? And I want you to know that invalidation will actually make the difficult feelings grow and become bigger and stick around longer. Validation, although it seems opposite, will help you move through those emotions much quicker. So what to do with these emotions? The only way out is through. Fighting them does not help. So what you resist will persist. Better to succumb to the emotions and recognize they're there and say, okay, what do I do with this? A lot of people spend and waste a lot of energy going back and forth about, should I be feeling this? Shouldn't I be feeling this? Why am I feeling this? How did this show up? You know, is this right? Is this the right thing to be feeling? Don't worry about any of that. That's like wasted energy. And when you're grieving, you don't have a lot of energy to spare. So rather than that, just say, I'm feeling really angry now. What does this anger need? This anger needs me to write a letter to the Ministry of Health that, you know, the visiting arrangements are unfair, or whatever it is, right? So what do I need to do with that to feel like I'm moving through it? You want to feel it, but you don't want to feed it. So you definitely want to feel your anger, but you don't want to feed it by punching things, expressing your anger in very aggressive ways, because that actually doesn't help you resolve your anger, despite what common statements would say. You want to use self-compassion. So I've used that word a few times. And what that really means is the ability to talk to yourself the way you would a good friend. And a way to know how compassionate you are to yourself is if you are talking to yourself and you think, if I said these exact same words to whoever that person is you love, to your best friend, to your child, to your parent, would they still talk to me after this? Or would I dare speak this way to somebody else? If the answer is no, then you're not being self-compassionate to yourself, and you can change that. So we are self-compassionate when we first acknowledge that we're hurting, we pay attention to it. We realize we're not alone in our struggle, that, you know, to be human means to struggle and have some suffering in our lives, and then offer the same kind of kindness and comfort to yourself that you would a good friend. You have rights as a griever. You are entitled to have an experience that honors your loss. And so you have the right to experience your grief in your own unique way. You have the right to talk about your death and your grief, or not talk. You have the right to feel a multitude of emotions. You have the right to be tolerant of your physical and emotional limits. And you have the right to experience grief bursts, which are those moments in which your grief kind of like your life shrinks again and you're back in your grief. And you're just like hit with that overwhelming wave of grief. Those are normal and those are okay. So you also want to get help if needed. So if we've talked about this and you're like, whew, okay, I think I'm grieving okay now after this conversation, after this webinar today, great, no problem. Still reach out and connect with others. So reframe your social distancing to physical distancing. We finally have the weather. We can have appropriate visits with people who matter to us at a distance. If you find that you watch this and you're like, you know, I still think after this that I'm having a lot of struggle and I may need some additional help, you can reach out. We have workshops and supports through the Hamilton Family Health Team, and you can find them on our website. Just Google Hamilton Family Health Team, or you can connect with your family doctor. There's a great resource for grief called mygrief.ca. It has resources and support available. Local, we have our Bob Camp Hospice, and they are doing virtual visits and supports at this time to help people process their grief. And we also have Bereaved Families of Ontario that run support groups and virtual support groups that are available to you if you need them. So I want you to think about the fact that grief is not a disorder, it's not a disease or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. Grief is the price we pay for love. So with great love comes great grief. And the only cure for grief is to grieve. So we are at the end of our show, of our webinar. I am going to put up a poll now that you can start to answer. So if you don't mind, taking a moment to answer these questions. I'm also opening it up. If anybody has any particular questions that they want to ask, you can use the chat feature, or you can use the Q&A feature, and I will read the question out loud without giving out personal details about you, and answer it out loud. Okay, so I'm just going to give it a couple minutes. I will stay on here till 12 o'clock. If there are any questions, or if there's anything that needs to be reviewed, I'm happy to do that in the next couple minutes. I just want to take this opportunity also to say thank you for allowing me to come and talk with you, and for taking your time and showing up to this webinar. I hope it has been helpful, and I hope that throughout this pandemic and this new time in life that you're all finding ways to take good care of yourselves. So thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity.